The gun was already pressed against Belle Archer's temple when Simon Shelby rode into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on the last day of October, 1878. She could feel the cold metal ring of the barrel against her skin, could hear the hammer click back with a sound like a bone snapping, and she refused to close her eyes. If she was going to die in the middle of Main Street with half the town watching from behind their shuttered windows, she was going to die looking straight ahead at the horizon, where the autumn sun was bleeding out across the prairie in shades of copper and rust. "You think I won't do it?" The man holding the gun was Harlan Cross, and his voice was the kind of voice that had been soaked in whiskey and cruelty for so many years it had turned to gravel. "You think I brought you all the way out here just to let you walk away?" Belle kept her breathing steady. "You brought me out here because you needed a wife who could read and write and keep your accounts," she said. "Killing me doesn't solve your problem, Harlan. It just makes a new one." "Wrong." His grip tightened on her arm. "Killing you solves everything. Because right now you're the only person alive who knows what I did to the Whitmore family, and dead women don't testify." The street was utterly silent. Not a single soul moved. The general store owner, a man named Purcell, peered through his glass like a man watching something happen in a dream he couldn't wake from. The two women outside the milliner's shop had pressed themselves flat against the wall. Even the horses at the hitching rail had gone still. And then a voice came from the far end of the street, calm as creek water in July. "Let her go." Belle turned her eyes without moving her head. A rider had stopped his horse about 40 feet away. Tall in the saddle, wearing a duster the color of desert sand, a hat pulled low over dark eyes. He sat utterly motionless, both hands visible, resting on the saddle horn. Harlan Cross laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Who the hell are you?" "A man who's going to give you one more chance to make the right choice," the rider said. That was the first moment Belle Archer ever looked at Simon Shelby. And even with a gun at her head, even with her heart slamming against her ribs and her mouth dry as dust, something in the way he sat that horse, something in the absolute steadiness of him, made the panic in her chest quiet down just enough to think. She thought, "Whoever he is, he means what he says." She thought, "I am not going to die today." She was right on both counts, but the road between that October morning and the life that would eventually be hers was longer and more dangerous than anything she could have imagined standing there on the dirt street of Caldwell with Harlan Cross's gun at her head. To understand how she got there, and how Simon Shelby came to ride into that exact town on that exact morning, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the letter that changed everything. Belle Archer had been born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a family that had more books than money and more pride than either. Her father had been a school teacher, her mother a seamstress, and between them they had raised 3 daughters with strong spines and independent minds, which was considered either an admirable quality or a dangerous one, depending on who you asked in the year 1878. Belle was the middle daughter, 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair and gray eyes that people who were being generous called striking, and people who were being honest called unsettling, because there was something in them that saw too clearly and held too steady for comfort. When her father died of fever in the spring of that year, and the family's small savings dissolved into medical debts and funeral costs, Belle did what practical women did in hard times. She answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, seeking a capable, educated woman of good character to serve as wife and household manager on a prosperous cattle ranch in Sumner County, Kansas. Applicant must be literate, willing to relocate, and of sound constitution. Generous arrangement offered. Respond to H. Cross, General Delivery, Caldwell, Kansas. The letters that followed were cordial, almost charming. Harlan Cross had described himself as a widower of 52, established in the cattle trade, a man of industry who required a capable partner to manage his household and assist with the correspondence and record-keeping that his business demanded. He had sent money for her train fare, a respectable sum, and a letter of introduction that spoke of a comfortable home, a staff of household help, and a genuine desire to provide for a woman of quality. Belle had known it might not be what it seemed. She was not naive. She had read enough to understand that the reality of the frontier rarely matched the promises made in Eastern newspapers. But she had also calculated her options carefully, and they were thin. Her mother needed support. Her elder sister was already married with children of her own and struggling. Her younger sister was barely 17. The teaching position Belle had hoped for had dissolved when the school board decided they preferred a man for the role. So she had packed 2 trunks, embraced her mother and sisters at the Cincinnati train station on a cool September morning, and boarded a westbound train with her heart set on making the best of whatever she found at the end of the line. What she found in Caldwell was not a prosperous ranch. It was a dilapidated house on the edge of town, a staff that consisted of one sullen housekeeper named Mrs. Pratt who looked at Belle with something between pity and warning, and Harlan Cross himself, who was nothing like his letters. He was larger than she had expected, with a face that had been handsome once and had since been used hard, and eyes the color of dirty water. He shook her hand at the train station with the businesslike manner of a man inspecting livestock, asked 3 sharp questions about her arithmetic, and told her she would begin reviewing his business ledgers in the morning. There was no warmth, no courtesy, and absolutely no sign of the gentlemanly widower his letters had promised. Belle had looked at him on that first evening and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach like a stone dropped in a well. She had made a serious mistake, but she was Belle Archer, and she did not panic. She smiled, thanked him for his hospitality, retired to the small bedroom Mrs. Pratt showed her, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and thought very carefully about her situation. She had no money of her own beyond a few dollars. She was 900 miles from home. She had no friends in this town and no one who was obligated to help her. And the man who had brought her here had a look about him that made the word danger rise in her mind with quiet insistence. She needed to understand what she had walked into. So she did what she always did when confronted with a problem. She gathered information. Over the first 2 weeks, Belle made herself useful and unobtrusive, which was a skill she had perfected in her years of teaching school in Cincinnati. She reviewed Harlan's ledgers as instructed, and what she found in those ledgers was deeply troubling. The numbers didn't add up in ways that spoke of simple carelessness. They told a story of money coming in from sources that had no legitimate accounting, of payments going out under names that corresponded to no business she could identify, of dates that, when she cross-referenced them quietly with the back copies of the Caldwell commercial newspaper that Mrs. Pratt kept in the kitchen for lighting fires, aligned with the disappearance of a family named Whitmore. The Whitmores had owned a spread of land north of town. They had been, according to the newspaper, a family of good standing, a father, mother, and 2 grown sons, who had simply ceased to be mentioned in local news in the spring of that year. No obituaries, no announcements of sale. Just a silence where a family had been. And in Harlan Cross's ledgers, a series of payments in March of that same year, under a column headed simply Land Acquisition, in amounts that were suspiciously round, suspiciously cash, and suspiciously absent of any formal deed notation. Belle had copied those entries in her small, precise handwriting onto a piece of paper she folded and tucked inside the lining of her second-best bonnet. She didn't know yet what she would do with the information, but she knew that information was the only real currency she had in this town. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks when Mrs. Pratt pulled her aside one evening and told her, in the flat, exhausted tone of a woman who had run out of the energy required for real emotion, that she should leave while she still could. "The last woman he sent for lasted 2 months, Mrs. Pratt said. They said she went back east. I don't believe it." Belle had stared at her. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're not stupid," Mrs. Pratt said, "and because it's the only decent thing I've got left in me to do." Then she walked back to the kitchen and didn't mention it again. Belle had gone to bed that night and lain awake for a very long time thinking about the Whitmore family and the woman who had supposedly gone back east and the weight of the folded paper inside her bonnet lining. By the end of week 4, she had a plan. It was a thin plan, but it was a plan. She would go to the county sheriff's office, present her evidence, and request both protection and assistance in sending a letter to her family. She knew the sheriff of Sumner County by name from the newspapers, a man named Briggs, who was described in the Caldwell commercial as a reliable officer of the law. What she did not know, when she slipped out of Harlan Cross's house on a cool October morning with her bonnet on her head and her evidence in its lining, was that Sheriff Briggs had been on Harlan Cross's informal payroll for the better part of 2 years. The meeting in Briggs's office lasted less than 10 minutes. He listened to her with a polite, attentive expression, took the copy of the ledger entries she offered him, thanked her for her civic concern, and sent her back to the house with a deputy escort and a quiet word to Harlan Cross before noon. Harlan came home that afternoon with his dirty water eyes gone hard as river ice, and he looked at Belle across the parlor and said, "I know what you did." Belle had known then that the situation had moved past the point of careful management. She had 2 choices, run or confront. She was physically incapable of running all the way to the train station before Harlan's men could cut her off. So she had looked him straight in the eye and said, "Then you know I kept copies." She hadn't. She had given everything to Briggs in the hope that it would be enough. But Harlan didn't know that, and the bluff had bought her 3 more days, days in which she was watched constantly, forbidden to leave the house, and increasingly aware that her time was running out. On the morning of the 31st of October, something broke in Harlan Cross's calculations. Belle didn't know what it was, some news brought by one of his men, some development in whatever scheme he was running that shifted the balance of his risk assessment. He came into the breakfast room where she was sitting with her tea, and his face told her everything she needed to know. He had decided that the bluff didn't matter. That even if copies existed somewhere, the risk of letting her live was greater than the risk of what he was about to do. "We're taking a walk," he said, and because his hired man Decker was standing behind her with the implicit threat of his entire considerable size, Belle walked, out the front door, down the porch steps, into the middle of Main Street, where Harlan Cross pressed a gun against her temple and told the watching town that dead women don't testify. And then Simon Shelby rode in. Simon Shelby had come to Caldwell on business that had nothing to do with Belle Archer. He was 30 years old, a former deputy marshal out of Wichita who had left the law 4 years earlier under circumstances that still woke him at 3 in the morning sometimes, though he had learned to lie still until his heartbeat settled. He owned a small spread of land 20 miles east of Caldwell, where he ran cattle with the help of 2 hired hands named Tomas and Dutch, and he supplemented his income with occasional contract work for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, tracking down cattle thieves and land fraudsters. He had a contract now. The railroad had received complaints about irregularities in land purchases in Sumner County, purchases that seemed to involve coercion of landowners and manipulation of county records, and they wanted someone to investigate quietly and report back. The name Harlan Cross had appeared in the railroad's preliminary inquiries. Simon had been on his way to do some discreet asking around when he rode into Caldwell and found a situation that was considerably less discreet than he had planned for. He had assessed the scene in about 4 seconds. Woman held at gunpoint, large crowd doing nothing, second man behind the woman, big, blocking her exit. Harlan Cross, who matched the description he'd been given, doing the holding. He had made a choice in those 4 seconds that he would later describe to Belle as the easiest decision he'd ever made, though it was also the one that changed everything. He kept his hands still and his voice level, and he gave Harlan Cross one chance to put the gun down. Harlan did not take the chance. He swung the gun towards Simon instead, which was the mistake that gave Belle the opportunity she had been calculating from the second she saw Simon ride in. She dropped her weight straight down, pulling free of Harlan's grip by pure force of gravity, and the fact that no man expects a woman in a skirt to simply collapse to the ground with that kind of deliberate purpose. She hit the dirt on her hands and knees and rolled to the side. Simon's hand moved from the saddle horn to his holster, so fast it was almost a single motion. The shot he fired was precise, a grazing wound to Harlan's gun hand that sent the pistol spinning into the dirt without killing anyone. Harlan screamed and clutched his hand. Decker lunged forward and Belle, still on the ground, swept his feet out from under him with a move she had not planned and could not have explained afterward, but which worked with absolute efficiency, sending the large man crashing face first into the street. And then it was over. The whole thing, from Simon's challenge to the sound of Decker hitting the dirt, had taken perhaps 20 seconds. Simon was off his horse and had Harlan cross his arms behind his back before the man finished screaming. He looked down at Belle, still on the ground, and said, "Are you hurt?" "No," Belle said. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt with the automatic gesture of a woman who had learned early that composure was its own form of armor, and looked at him. Up close he was lean and weathered, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were dark brown and direct. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still need someone to arrest this man who is not the county sheriff." "That is going to be a problem," Belle said. "The county sheriff is involved." Simon looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Harlan Cross, who was bleeding and swearing with impressive inventiveness, and then back at Belle. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." They didn't have the luxury of telling everything right there in the street. Simon bound Harlan's hands with his own rope and told the town's population, who had by now crept out from behind their shuttered windows and were watching with the fascinated blankness of people who had been astonished past the point of reaction, that Harlan Cross was being detained pending a federal inquiry. The railroad contract in his pocket gave him just enough authority to say that and have it mean something, though the exact jurisdictional question was considerably murkier than he let on. He sent Decker off with a firm instruction and the clear implication that things would go worse for him if he came back, and Decker, who was loyal to Harlan's money and not to Harlan himself, decided that the money wasn't worth the trouble anymore and left at a pace that suggested he agreed. Belle directed Simon to the general store, where Purcell, shaken out of his inaction by the turn of events, provided a back room and the use of his lockable storage cellar for Harlan Cross. Simon sent a wire from the telegraph office at the train station, addressed to the federal marshal's office in Wichita, and then he and Belle sat down in the back room of Purcell's store with 2 cups of coffee that Purcell's wife brought in with the slightly dazed air of a woman doing something normal in the middle of a completely abnormal situation, and Belle told him everything. She was thorough and precise. She described the letters, the journey, the ledgers, what she had found in them, the Whitmore family, her attempt to go to Briggs and how it had backfired, the 3 days of house arrest, and the events of the morning. She told it in order without embellishment, and she did not cry, though there was a moment when her voice thinned slightly and she paused to take a careful breath before continuing. Simon listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them specific and practical. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The ledger copies," he said. "You said you bluffed about having them." "Yes, but you remember what they contained." "With considerable accuracy, yes. Then you can reconstruct them." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "That's good. That's actually very good." Then he said, "My name is Simon Shelby. I'm a former deputy marshal working a railroad contract. This is going to get complicated before it gets simple." "I didn't think it was going to be simple," Belle said. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you did." That was their first real conversation. It was entirely practical and completely without pretense, and the thing that Belle noticed about it, in the way you notice small details that only become meaningful later, was that he spoke to her exactly as he would have spoken to another man with information he needed. No softening, no condescension, no suggestion that the facts might be too much for her. He took her seriously from the first moment. She filed that away with the same care she filed everything. The federal marshal's office responded to Simon's wire by the following afternoon. A deputy marshal named Greer would arrive in Caldwell within 3 days. In the meantime, Simon was authorized to hold Harlan Cross and to conduct preliminary interviews. Belle was requested to remain in Caldwell as a material witness. That created a logistical problem, because Belle had nowhere to stay that wasn't Harlan Cross's house, which she had no intention of returning to. And Caldwell's single hotel was a rough establishment that catered primarily to cattle drovers, and that Simon, with the flat practicality of a man who understood how the world worked, told her was not suitable. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. A woman named Clara Holt, who ran the milliner's shop, appeared at Purcell's store that afternoon with an offer of her spare room and a casserole of remarkable quality. She was a widow in her 40s with a face like a kind apple and a manner of absolute decisiveness that Belle found immediately reassuring. "You'll stay with me," Clara said. "I have a lock on the spare room door and a shotgun under my bed, and nobody in this town is fool enough to test either one." Belle accepted, and over the following 3 days while they waited for Deputy Marshal Greer, she stayed in Clara's spare room and worked with Simon to reconstruct the evidence. They worked at Clara's kitchen table, which was large and solid and practical, with the remains of various meals pushed to one side to make room for Belle's reconstructed ledger pages and Simon's notes, and the maps of the county that Purcell had provided. Mrs. Pratt, who had apparently been waiting for an opportunity to do the decent thing in a more comprehensive way than a single warning, presented herself on the second day with a box of papers she had taken from Harlan Cross's study before anyone thought to stop her, papers that significantly corroborated and expanded Belle's reconstructed records. Simon looked at the papers Mrs. Pratt laid on Clara's table and then looked at the woman herself. "You've been holding these since March," Mrs. Pratt said, "since I started to understand what happened to the Whitmores." "That took courage," Simon said. Mrs. Pratt looked at him with her flat, exhausted expression. "It took longer than courage should have taken," she said. "I'm not proud of that." It was something in the way she said it that made Belle look up from the pages she was sorting. The woman was not asking for absolution. She was stating a fact about herself with the same honesty she would apply to any other fact. Belle thought that was a form of integrity, and she said so. Mrs. Pratt looked at her, and for the first time in Belle's experience, the woman's expression changed from flat exhaustion to something warmer. Not quite a smile, but something. Simon worked with a focused efficiency that Belle found herself watching when she thought he wasn't looking. He had a way of cutting to the essential question in every problem, of laying out the structure of a situation with a clarity that reminded her of her father's best teaching, the kind of thinking that showed you how things connected rather than just what they were. He had been a lawman, and it showed, not in any swagger or hardness, but in the precision of how he organized information and the quietness of how he carried himself, as if he had learned through experience that the men who made the most noise were rarely the ones who got things done. On the evening of the second day, after Mrs. Pratt had gone home and Clara was in the shop front working on a hat order, they were alone at the kitchen table for the first time. Belle was writing out a clean copy of the reconstructed ledger entries. Simon was reviewing his notes. The lamp between them made the room feel smaller and warmer than it was. "Can I ask you something?" Belle said without looking up from her writing. "Go ahead. Why did you stay after you had him secured, after you sent the wire? You could have simply handed this over to Greer and moved on." Simon was quiet for a moment. "Because the situation wasn't secure," he said. "Briggs is still out there. Cross still has allies in this town. You're a witness who's already been threatened once." "That's practical reasoning," Belle said. "But there's more to it than that." She looked up then. He was watching her with the direct brown eyes that she had gotten used to over 2 days of working side by side. but that still sometimes caught her off guard with their steadiness. "When I rode into this town," he said slowly, as if he was working it out as he spoke, "and I saw what was happening in that street, I made a choice. And when you got yourself off that ground and started talking sense before the dust had settled, I understood that you were someone who deserved better than what had been done to her. And that's not a practical reason, that's a human one." Belle looked at him for a long moment. The lamp flickered in a draft from the window. "All right," she said, and went back to her writing. But something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with any declaration. Just the quiet shift of two people who have been existing in each other's company as colleagues, and have acknowledged, without quite saying so, that they are also existing in each other's company as something else. Something they haven't named yet, and are not ready to name but are no longer pretending isn't there. Deputy Marshal Greer arrived on the third day. A compact, serious man from Wichita, who reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He spent 2 hours with Belle taking her formal statement, another hour with Simon going over the investigation notes, and a final hour in the storage cellar with Harlan Cross that produced sounds Belle was glad she couldn't quite hear from Clara's kitchen. When Greer came out of the cellar, he had a signed confession and a list of names that included not only Sheriff Briggs but 2 members of the county land office and a cattle broker in Wichita who had been facilitating the resale of the Whitmore land. The Whitmore family, Greer told them with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news that could not be made better by how it was delivered, had been found alive. A father and a mother and 2 sons living under assumed names in Colorado, where they had fled after Harlan Cross and his allies had made their continued presence on their own land a matter of life and death through a campaign of threats, theft of livestock, and one fire that had barely spared the farmhouse. They were alive. Belle closed her eyes for a moment when Greer said that, and let the relief move through her cleanly. Briggs was arrested before noon. The 2 land office men were detained by telegraphed order. The cattle broker in Wichita would be picked up within the week. Harlan Cross was transferred to federal custody and would stand trial in the spring, along with whatever co-conspirators the investigation produced. The crisis, the immediate acute danger of Belle's situation, was resolved. She sat in Clara's kitchen that afternoon with a cup of tea that had gone cold and thought about what came next. She could go home to Cincinnati. She should go home to Cincinnati. Her mother needed her, or would benefit from her presence, and there was nothing holding her in Caldwell now. The immediate work of the investigation had given her a structure, a purpose, something to do with her hands and her mind that kept the full weight of the preceding weeks from landing on her all at once. Without that structure, the weight arrived, the loneliness of the original journey, the fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully while she was in Harlan's house. The particular humiliation of having been deceived so thoroughly, of having been desperate enough that a man's smooth letters had been enough to pull her 900 miles from home. She didn't cry because she rarely cried, but she sat with it honestly, the way Mrs. Pratt had sat with her own delayed conscience, without pretending it was smaller than it was. Clara came in and found her sitting there and set a fresh cup of tea in front of her without comment, and Belle looked up and said, "Thank you for all of it." "Don't be ridiculous," Clara said. "Eat something." Simon knocked at Clara's front door in the late afternoon. Clara let him in and then found something urgent to do in the back of the shop, with the tactful efficiency of a woman who understood the situation better than either of its principals did. He sat down across from Belle at the kitchen table, which had become in 3 days a place that felt almost familiar, and looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him. "Greer says you're free to go," he said. "He may need you back for the trial in spring, but that's months away. You can go home." "I know," Belle said. "What are you thinking?" She looked at him. "I'm thinking that I came out here because I had no other options and it nearly got me killed, and I can go back to Cincinnati and still have no other options, and that's not a satisfying conclusion." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the careful deliberateness of a man who had thought about what he was going to say, and was saying it anyway despite whatever caution was telling him to hold back. I'm thinking that I have a ranch 20 miles east of here that needs more management than 2 hired hands and a man who spends half his time chasing other people's problems. I'm thinking that the situation you were hired into was a fraud, but that the underlying need, someone literate who can manage accounts and correspondence and keep things running properly, that's real. And I'm thinking that I'm asking you this wrong, and that I should probably not be asking you this at all because you've just been through something frightening and you don't know me, and it would be entirely reasonable for you to tell me to go to hell. Belle looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the October wind had picked up, and she could hear it working at the corner of the building. "You're asking me to come and manage your ranch," she said. "I'm asking you to consider it," he said, "as a legitimate employment arrangement, with proper wages and your own space, and no coercion of any kind. And I want to be honest with you that I'm also asking because I find I have an interest in your continued proximity that is not entirely professional, and I thought you deserved to know that so you can factor it into your decision." Belle stared at him. Then, to her own surprise, she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one, sudden and real. "That is the most careful declaration of interest I have ever heard," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something close to one, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch slightly before she controlled it. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it's funny, you're treating it like a contract negotiation." "Old habits," he said. Belle looked down at her cold tea and then back up at him. "I will think about it," she said. "Seriously, I will actually think about it, but I need a few days." "Take what you need," he said. She took 5 days. She wrote a long letter to her mother explaining everything that had happened and asking for her opinion, which she knew her mother would give candidly. She walked around Caldwell in the sharp November air that had replaced the October warmth and thought about what she wanted. Not what she needed, not what was practical, but what she genuinely wanted. She wanted to stay, and the force of that wanting surprised her. Not because of the land, which was beautiful in a way she was only beginning to appreciate, the vastness of the Kansas sky, the way the light moved across the prairie at dawn in long gold sheets, the smell of cold sage and horse and smoke that was nothing like Cincinnati, and that she was finding, to her considerable surprise, that she liked. Not only because of the land, though the land was part of it. She wrote in her journal, which she had kept since she was 14, and which she had brought west in her second trunk, "I think I am a person who requires a large horizon. I did not know this about myself until I had one." And she sat with the question of Simon Shelby with the same honesty she sat with everything. She liked him. She respected him, which she had always considered more foundational than liking and far more durable. She found him attractive, which she noted with the scientific interest she applied to all observations about herself, because he was not conventionally handsome in the way the word was usually applied, but there was something in his physical presence, the quietness of it, the economy of movement, the way he looked at things, that she found she thought about more than was strictly necessary for professional purposes. She was also aware that she did not know him well. 3 days of working alongside someone under stressful conditions gave you a specific kind of knowledge about them, the knowledge of how they behaved under pressure, how they made decisions, whether they were honest, whether they were kind. She had found him to be all 3 of those things, but there was a great deal she didn't know, including whatever circumstances had led him to leave the law 4 years ago, which she had not asked about and he had not offered. She sent her mother's letter. She received her mother's response 8 days later, which was impressively fast and which contained the following: "My darling Belle, you have never in your life made a decision that I could predict, and I have never in your life seen you be wrong about a person you had taken the trouble to observe carefully. I trust your eyes. Come home if you need to, but if your eyes are telling you something, listen to them." She went to find Simon Shelby. He was at Purcell's store, making arrangements for some supplies. She waited until he had finished his transaction and then walked with him out to where his horse was tied at the hitching rail, and she said, "I'll come." He turned to look at her. The November light was thin and clear, and it fell across the street at a low angle that made everything look very precise. "All right," he said. "I want a fair wage," she said, "and I want to be clear that I am coming as an employee who will decide what else she is as she sees fit and on her own timeline." "That's exactly how it should be," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we have an agreement." They shook hands, and both of them were aware that the handshake was somewhat formal under the circumstances, and neither of them said so. But something in the way Simon Shelby's hand held hers, carefully, firmly, just a fraction of a second longer than a purely professional handshake required, told Belle everything she needed to know about the sincerity of what he had said to her in Clara's kitchen. She said goodbye to Clara Holt with genuine regret. Clara pressed a box of baked goods into her hands and told her to come back for the trial and to write, and then added in the tone of a woman issuing a practical instruction, "He's a good man. Good men are not as common as they should be. Don't be so cautious that you miss it." "I'm not cautious," Belle said. "I'm thorough." "That can mean the same thing," Clara said and hugged her. They rode out to Simon's ranch in the late afternoon of a cool November day, Belle on a hired horse that Simon had arranged, her two trunks loaded in the back of Purcell's borrowed wagon driven by Purcell's teenage son. The land opened up around them as they left town, the prairie rolling out in long swells of dried grass that caught the low light and turned it to amber and gold. Simon rode beside her for a while in silence, the comfortable kind, and then said, "The two men who work the ranch are Tomas Ruiz and Dutch Elliott. Tomas has been with me 3 years, Dutch a little less. They're both good workers and they won't give you any trouble." "What makes you so confident of that?" Belle asked, not challengingly, just curious. "Because I'll tell them that if they do, they'll answer to me," he said simply. "I'm capable of addressing my own difficulties," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I've seen you do it, but it's not the same thing as me making my expectations clear at the outset." She considered that. "Fair enough," she said. The ranch was modest by the standards she had read about in Eastern newspaper accounts of Western spreads, but it was real and solid in a way Harlan Cross's house had never been. The main house was a one-story structure of wood and stone, larger than it looked from the outside, with a good solid porch and a kitchen that had been added on at some point and was the best room in the building, warm and practical. Tomas and Dutch greeted her with the careful courtesy of men who had been firmly instructed in advance and who were also, Belle could see, genuinely curious about her. Tomas Ruiz was 35, a lean, quiet man from Texas with excellent Spanish and nearly as good English, and a way of working that reminded Belle of Simon, methodical and efficient. Dutch Elliott was younger, maybe 26, broad-shouldered and cheerful with a laugh that went off like a shot from a rifle, sudden and complete. She shook both their hands and said, "I'm Belle Archer. I understand the accounts are somewhat behind." Dutch's laugh went off. Tomas smiled slightly. Simon, behind her, said nothing, but she had the distinct impression he was doing something with his expression that required effort. "About 3 months behind," Tomas said. "He doesn't like numbers." "I do," Belle said. "Show me where they're kept." She spent her first evening at the Shelby Ranch going through 3 months of accumulated receipts, livestock records, and hay purchase invoices, which had been stored in a wooden box under the kitchen table with the organizational system of a windstorm. She found 2 arithmetic errors that had cost Simon $14 and a discrepancy in the livestock count that, when she brought it to his attention the next morning, led to the discovery that 3 calves had been miscounted and were actually in the south pasture all along, which Dutch took personal and public credit for despite having nothing to do with it. She began to settle in with the focused adaptability that was one of her strongest qualities. The ranch work was new to her in its specifics, but familiar in its rhythms. Work that needed doing, problems that needed solving, people whose strengths and weaknesses you learned and worked with rather than against. She was not a rancher, but she was a manager of systems, and a ranch was a system. And she learned its particulars with the same method she had applied to Harlan Cross's ledgers: observation, organization, cross-reference. Within 2 weeks she had the accounts in order, had established a workable record-keeping system that Tomas said was the best thing that had happened to the ranch in 4 years, and had begun a correspondence with several cattle buyers in Wichita that Simon had been meaning to pursue for months. She and Simon fell into a rhythm. He was out early with the work of the ranch, and she managed the house and the accounts and the correspondence during the day, and in the evenings they ate together with Tomas and Dutch, and talked about the day's work and the state of the range and the news from the Caldwell commercial, which arrived by rider twice a week. The evenings were her favorite part of the day, not in any dramatic sense, just the warm ordinariness of a shared meal and easy conversation. Simon was a different person at his own table than he was in the middle of a crisis. He had opinions about cattle breeding that he would argue with surprising passion. He had a dry wit that surfaced unexpectedly, and that made Belle laugh more often than she had expected. And he had a habit of asking questions that showed he had been listening to whatever she had said the previous day, and was following the thread of it. She was drawn to him with increasing conviction. Not the sharp, startling attraction of the street in Caldwell, though that remained as an undercurrent, but something slower and more certain, the kind of feeling that comes from watching someone be consistently themselves in small circumstances, and finding that the self they are is the self you want to be near. She was also patient. She had told him she would decide things on her own timeline, and she held to that not out of stubbornness, but because she had learned from painful recent experience the cost of moving into a situation before she understood it fully. She wanted to understand him fully, which meant she needed to ask about the thing he hadn't told her. She asked on a cold December evening after supper, when Tomas and Dutch had gone to the bunkhouse, and she and Simon were sitting by the fire in the main room, she with her mending and he with a copy of the Kansas Farmer that he had been reading with the focused inattention of a man whose mind was elsewhere. "You left the Marshal Service 4 years ago," she said. He looked up from the paper. "You haven't told me why," she said. "You don't have to, but I would like to know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he folded the paper and set it aside with the careful movement of a man organizing himself for something that required care. "I was involved in an incident," he said. "In a town called Harper, west of Wichita. We got word that a man named Cutter, who we'd been after for 2 years for stage robbery and assault, was holed up in a house on the edge of town. I led the team that went in." He stopped. "There was a woman in the house. She wasn't connected to Cutter. She was the previous occupant and we didn't know she was there. She was hurt when we broke the door in the dark, not badly but hurt." Belle waited. "She recovered," Simon said, "and Cutter was taken. And my superiors decided the incident had been handled correctly given the information we had at the time, and they were probably right. But I had been the one to make the call to go in at night without better intelligence, and the woman's face when I realized what had happened." He stopped again. "I couldn't continue doing work where that kind of error was acceptable, so I left." Belle looked at him across the firelight. He was telling it plainly, without self-pity and without seeking absolution, in exactly the way she had respected in Mrs. Pratt. Not asking her to tell him it wasn't his fault, just telling her what had happened. "What did you do after?" she asked. "Came here," he said. "Bought the land, started the ranch. Took the railroad work because it's investigation mostly. Mostly no one gets hurt." "Mostly," Belle said. "Mostly," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment and thought about a man who had left a career not because it was ordered but because his own conscience had drawn a line that his superiors hadn't drawn, and who had spent 4 years building something quiet and real on the Kansas prairie as a way of becoming someone he could stand to be. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You asked," he said. "You were always going to get a straight answer." The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind worked at the porch boards with the steady determination of a Kansas winter. "Simon," she said. He looked at her. "I think I should tell you that I am no longer proceeding cautiously. I thought you should know, so you can factor it into your own considerations." The expression that moved across his face then was not anything she could have described easily, because it was several things at once. Relief and warmth and something that looked very much like the careful, steady happiness of a man who has been hoping for something, and has learned to hold the hope quietly for so long that the arrival of the thing is almost surprising. "I appreciate the notification," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than usual. "You're welcome," she said. He crossed the room, and she stood up to meet him, and when he kissed her, it was exactly what she might have predicted from everything she knew of him, direct and honest and not tentative at all, a kiss that said what it meant. She kissed him back in kind. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Belle Archer's life so far, and she was clear-eyed enough about herself to know it. She was not a woman given to romantic hyperbole, but she was also not a woman given to understating things that were true. She was happy in a way that was specific and grounded, not the dizzy happiness of uncertainty, but the deep-settled happiness of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the person she was supposed to be with. They were easy together in the way that people are easy together when they have learned each other's characters before they learned each other's hearts, so that the romance was built on a foundation that could actually bear the weight of it. They argued about things they disagreed on, which included the proper method of account classification, the comparative merits of the Union Pacific versus the Kansas Pacific as commercial entities, and on one memorable occasion the exact timing of the spring cattle drive, an argument that Belle won through the application of 3 months of weather records she had been quietly tracking in the back pages of the accounts ledger. "You were keeping weather records," Simon said, when she produced them. "I keep records of everything potentially relevant," she said. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to think of as his most honest one, the one that had no performance in it at all. "I think you might be the most formidable person I have ever met," he said. "Thank you," she said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, full and real, and it still surprised her every time she heard it because it was so much larger than his general quietness suggested, and she loved it every time. She loved him. She had arrived at that knowledge through the same careful accumulation of evidence she applied to all important conclusions, and having arrived at it, she didn't second-guess it. She hadn't yet said it to him, because she was waiting for the right moment, not the right moment in a romantic sense, but the right moment in an honest sense, when the words would be fully what she meant them to be. January brought a cold snap that froze the water troughs and kept them all close to the house for 3 days, burning through more firewood than Tomas had thought to stack, a miscalculation that Belle noted in the records with the notation, a just estimate for January 1879, for the following year. During those 3 days, confined to the house and the nearby barn, the 4 of them played cards and drank coffee and talked, and Belle learned more about Tomas and Dutch than she had in the previous 2 months, and liked them both more for what she learned. Tomas had a wife and 2 children in San Antonio, who he sent money to every month, and planned to bring north in the spring when Simon could spare him the time for the journey. Dutch, whose real name was Hendrik Elliott but who had been called Dutch since the age of 7, due to an incident involving a windmill and a piece of Dutch machinery that he refused to describe in detail, had come west from Ohio at 19 looking for something he couldn't name, but that he thought was probably land of his own eventually, and he was saving toward it with the methodical seriousness that sat entertainingly at odds with his general exuberance. On the second evening of the cold snap, after a supper of excellent bean soup that Belle had made from the ham bone and the last of the dried beans, with cornbread that had turned out better than she had expected given that she had learned to make it only 6 weeks ago, Tomas proposed a toast. "To the boss finding someone who can keep his books and doesn't let him get away with anything," he said, which was both a compliment and an extremely accurate description, and Simon accepted it with good grace and Belle laughed. After Tomas and Dutch went to the bunkhouse, which was warm enough with its small iron stove, and the main house was quiet, Belle and Simon sat by the fire with the particular coziness of people weather-bound in a warm house while the cold does its work outside, and she told him she loved him. She said it the way she said all important things, directly and without preamble, though the directness was not the same as the professional directness she used for accounts and evidence. It had something softer in it. "I love you," she said. "I've been working up to saying it for a few weeks, and I decided there was no reason to continue postponing it." Simon looked at her for a long moment with those steady dark eyes. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since you got yourself off the ground in the middle of Main Street and started making practical assessments before the dust settled." "That was the first day," she said. "Yes," he said. "You've been in love with me for 3 months and you didn't say anything." "You told me you were on your own timeline," he said. "I was respecting it." Belle stared at him. Then she said, "Simon Shelby, I genuinely cannot decide if that is the most romantic thing I have ever heard or the most infuriating." "Probably both," he said. She kissed him with considerable feeling, and he held her in a way that suggested that 3 months of respecting someone's timeline had produced a considerable amount of contained feeling that was now very glad to have somewhere to go. February arrived with more snow and a letter from the federal marshal's office in Wichita confirming that Belle's testimony would be required at Harlan Cross's trial, scheduled for the first week of March in the Sumner County Courthouse, which was to be relocated to Wichita for the purpose given the extent of the corruption in Caldwell's own county apparatus. Belle had been expecting this and was ready for it. She had been maintaining her reconstructed ledger records with careful updates from the official documents that Greer had sent copies of in January. She was also, she discovered when the letter arrived, somewhat anxious about it in a way that she acknowledged honestly and did not attempt to suppress. Seeing Harlan Cross again in a courtroom was going to be unpleasant. Testifying to what she had experienced and discovered while she had been in his house was going to require her to be, in public and on record, exactly as clear-eyed as she was capable of being about a period that, now that the immediate danger was past, she could feel fully in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel it at the time. Simon drove her to Wichita in early March, a 2-day journey by wagon that they made with the company of Tomas, who had taken the opportunity to go fetch his family from San Antonio and would part from them in Wichita. They stopped overnight at a way station that offered a reasonable meal and warm enough beds, and Belle sat outside after supper in the cold, clear air of early March and looked at the stars, which were extraordinary in their density and brilliance over the open Kansas plain, and thought about the distance she had traveled in 6 months, not the physical distance, though that was considerable, but the interior distance. From the woman who had gotten on a train in Cincinnati with 2 trunks and a desperate practicality, to the woman sitting on a step in Kansas, looking at the stars with a quiet happiness in her chest that felt like the most permanent thing she had ever known. Simon came and sat beside her. He said nothing for a while and she said nothing, and the stars continued their extraordinary display. "Are you ready for this?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I'm testifying about the railroad investigation," he said. "That's straightforward. I'm more concerned about you." "I know," she said, "but I don't need you to be concerned. I need you to be there." "I'll be there," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold March air under the Kansas stars with the plain simplicity of 2 people who had gotten, against the odds, and through a sequence of events that neither of them had chosen but both of them had navigated with what they had, exactly where they needed to be. The trial of Harlan Cross lasted 3 days. The Wichita courthouse was packed on all 3 days with observers, because the scope of the conspiracy had become widely known in the weeks since the arrests, and the story of what had happened to the Whitmore family had generated the kind of moral outrage that the frontier community, which had a practical understanding of the importance of property rights and physical safety, was particularly capable of. Belle testified on the second day. She sat in the witness chair and answered the questions put to her by the federal prosecutor with precision and without embellishment. And when the defense attorney tried the established tactic of suggesting that a young woman from the East couldn't really be expected to understand what she had seen in the ledgers, she looked at him with the gray eyes that saw too clearly and held too steady for comfort, and gave an answer of such technical and organized specificity that the defense attorney sat back down without following up. The Whitmore family was present in the courthouse. An older man with a weathered face and his wife and two sons in their 20s, all of them with the careful stillness of people who had been frightened for a long time and were still learning to stop being frightened. Belle met them in the corridor on the second afternoon, and the older man, whose name was Eli Whitmore, took her hand with both of his and said, "What you did in getting that evidence mattered. I want you to know that." Belle looked at him and thought about the months of fear and the folded paper in the bonnet lining and the cold stone in her stomach on the day she arrived in Caldwell, and knew she had made a serious mistake. "I'm glad it helped," she said. "I'm very glad your family is safe." Harlan Cross was convicted on all counts. He received a sentence of 30 years in federal prison to be served at the facility in Leavenworth. Sheriff Briggs and the two land office men received lesser sentences. The cattle broker in Wichita, whose involvement turned out to be extensive, received 20 years. When the verdict was read, Belle sat in the gallery next to Simon and felt something release in her chest. Something she hadn't fully known was held there. A last residue of the fear she had carried since the morning she arrived in Caldwell and found things were not what they had been promised. It released quietly, like a breath held too long finally let go. She looked at Simon. He was looking at her. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's done." She reached over and took his hand, right there in the courthouse gallery with the bailiff calling order and the gallery buzzing around them, and he held it in both of his with the same careful firmness she had felt when they shook hands on the day she agreed to come to the ranch, except that this time there was nothing professional about it at all. They stayed in Wichita for one additional day so that Belle could meet with the federal prosecutor to provide any final clarifying information he might need, and Simon used the time to conduct some business with the Kansas Pacific Railroad's Wichita office, which included submitting his final report on the investigation, and as he mentioned to Belle in the matter-of-fact way he mentioned important things, resigning his contract work. "Resigning," she said. "I have a ranch to run," he said. "And as of about a month ago, I have considerably better reasons than I did previously to be present on it." Belle looked at him. "You don't have to stop working for the railroad on my account." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "there is." They drove back to the ranch in early spring, the March light already longer and more golden than the winter had been, and the prairie was beginning its slow greening, the dead winter grass giving way in patches to the first new growth of the year. Belle watched the land change as they drove and thought about returning, about the particular feeling of going back to a place that had become, in the space of only a few months, the place that felt most like home. Tomas was not with them on the return journey. He had gone south from Wichita to San Antonio to fetch his wife Maria and their two boys, aged 9 and 6, with a date set for his return to the ranch in April. Dutch had held things together in their absence, with the cheerful competence that made him invaluable despite his sometimes spectacular approach to situations. When they pulled into the ranch yard in the late afternoon of the second day of their return journey, Dutch came out of the barn with hay on his jacket and what appeared to be a slightly guilty expression. "Everything's fine," he said before either of them had spoken. "What happened?" Simon said. "The south pasture fence needs repair," Dutch said. "But other than that, completely fine." "What happened to the south pasture fence?" Belle asked. "Badger," Dutch said. "A badger broke the fence," Simon said. "Not exactly broke," Dutch said. I was chasing it out and I maybe ran into the fence a little bit." Belle pressed her lips together very firmly. Simon looked at the sky with the expression of a man counting to 10. Then Dutch laughed his rifle-shot laugh, and the tension broke, and they all laughed together in the ranch yard while the spring evening came down around them in shades of amber and rose. That spring was the most satisfying period Belle had known. The ranch work expanded with the season, calves arriving, planting the kitchen garden she had planned since February with seeds ordered from a catalog, the return of Tomas with his wife Maria and their sons, which transformed the social landscape of the ranch in ways that were entirely pleasant. Maria Ruiz was a small, fierce, warm woman who arrived with strong opinions and excellent cooking, and an immediate comprehensive assessment of Belle that she delivered 3 days after her arrival, with the directness of a woman who didn't see the point of indirection. "You're good for him," Maria said, indicating Simon with a slight tilt of her head. They were in the kitchen together, Belle working on the accounts and Maria preparing a meal that was already making the whole house smell extraordinary. He was too alone before, not unhappy, but too alone. "He's not a man who shows loneliness easily," Belle said. "No," Maria said, "which makes it easy to miss. You didn't miss it." Belle thought about that. "No," she said, "I suppose I didn't." On a May evening when the light stayed late and warm and the prairie was fully green and the air smelled of wild flowers and new grass, Simon asked Belle to marry him. He did it on the porch after supper, just the two of them, with the sunset doing something magnificent to the west. He did it with the directness that was his essential quality, not elaborate, not theatrical, just entirely honest. "I want to ask you something," he said. Belle, who knew him very well by now and had already made certain calculations about the timing and location of this moment, said, "Yes." He blinked. "I haven't asked yet." "I know," she said. "I'm answering in advance. You have my full attention." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was both amused and completely serious. "Belle Archer," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said for the second time, "I will." He took her hands in his and looked at her in the warm evening light and said, "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met." "I know," she said, "but thank you for saying so." He laughed and she laughed, and the prairie stretched out around the porch in its full summer abundance, and somewhere in the south pasture, where the fence had long since been repaired, a calf called to its mother in the golden evening air. They were married in June, in the small church in Caldwell that Belle had never been inside during her frightened weeks in Harlan Cross's house. Clara Holt came to the wedding with a hat of her own creation that was the most spectacular object Belle had ever seen in person, and she wore it with the authority of its maker. Tomas and Maria Ruiz stood up with them, Tomas as Simon's witness and Maria as Belle's. Dutch sat in the front pew and cried with the unself-conscious thoroughness of a man who saw no reason to contain a genuine emotion. Belle's mother came from Cincinnati. She arrived 2 days before the wedding on the train, a small, upright woman with Belle's gray eyes and a posture that suggested she had raised 3 daughters with strong spines partly by example. She walked through the ranch with Simon on the first afternoon, asking questions about the cattle operation and the land and the account structure with the focused curiosity of a woman doing an assessment, and by dinner that evening she had given her verdict, which was that the ranch was well managed, the company was good, and her daughter looked happier than she had ever seen her. "You did all right," she said to Simon, which was high praise. "She did all right," Simon said. "I just had the sense to recognize it." Belle's mother looked at him for a moment with the gray eyes. Then she said, "Yes, I believe you did, and that was that." The wedding ceremony was simple and real. Belle wore a dress she and Maria had made together over 3 weeks of evenings, ivory lawn cotton, with a collar of white embroidery that Maria had done by hand, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that she had gone out and gathered herself that morning from the South Meadow, because she had not intended to rely on anyone else for that particular detail. When the preacher asked if she would take Simon Shelby as her husband, she said, "I will," with the same directness she applied to all important affirmations, looking straight at him, and his expression in that moment was something she thought she would keep with her for the rest of her life. The open, uncalculated happiness of a man who has not allowed himself to expect too much from the world, and finds that the world has given him more than he calculated for. He kissed her with a crowd of people watching and Dutch crying and Clara's spectacular hat trembling with its owner's emotion. And the preacher said something about what God had joined together. And Belle thought about the October morning in Main Street, and the moment she had looked at this man and thought, "I am not going to die today," and how that thought had led, by a route she could not have predicted, to this exact moment in a small Kansas church, with his hands holding hers, and the summer light coming through the plain glass windows, and her mother crying quietly in the front pew next to a weeping Dutch. The two of them apparently having found common cause in the shared experience of being entirely happy for someone else. The summer continued warm and good. The cattle came in above weight at the fall drive, the best result Simon's ranch had produced since he bought the land, which Belle attributed to the improved record-keeping and management systems she had implemented, and Simon attributed to the combination of good weather, excellent work by Tomas and Dutch, and the fact that he was, he said, simply happier than he had been, and that this probably affected his judgment positively. "That's not a verifiable correlation," Belle said. "No," he agreed, "but I believe it anyway." She discovered she was expecting a child in the late autumn of 1879, a year almost exactly to the day from her arrival in Caldwell on the train with 2 trunks and a desperate practicality. She told Simon in the kitchen in the evening after supper, sitting across from him at the table that had become the center of their shared life, the table where they had worked through the evidence that brought Harlan Cross to justice, where they ate their meals, where they played cards with Tomas and Maria, where Belle kept her accounts, and Simon kept his ranch records, and Dutch occasionally appeared with a question he had obviously been working up the courage to ask. Simon's face when she told him was something she had to look at carefully to read, because it went through several things at once, wonder and happiness and a kind of solemn weight that was not sadness but the bearing of something enormous. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I feel entirely normal. I expect I will continue to feel entirely normal for several more months, and then I will feel very different." He came around the table and held her with the gentleness of a man who has just been shown something fragile and precious, and she let him, resting her head against his chest and listening to his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, the same rhythm she had come to know over a year of sleeping beside him in the room at the front of the house with the window that looked east toward the morning. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will be honest," he said. "I'm somewhat terrified." "So am I," she said. "But we are both competent people and we will figure it out." He laughed, the big real laugh that she loved. "Of course we will," he said. She wrote to her mother with the news, and her mother responded with a letter of 10 pages containing practical advice on every aspect of pregnancy and infancy that Belle read with the thorough attention she gave to all useful information, marking several passages she intended to refer back to. Maria Ruiz, whose own 2 boys had been born in San Antonio with a midwife she trusted absolutely, gave her a different kind of information, the kind that comes from experience rather than advice, the specific physical and emotional reality of expecting a child in a small house on the Kansas prairie, and she gave it with the directness that Belle had come to love in her, sparing nothing but also frightening nothing. "You'll manage," Maria said. "You manage everything." "Not everything," Belle said. "Everything that matters," Maria said. The ranch continued through the winter of 1879 into 1880, with the rhythm of work and weather, and shared meals and evenings by the fire that was now, definitively and unmistakably, the rhythm of Belle Archer's life, which had become Belle Shelby in the records, though she kept Archer in her own correspondence as a secondary name because it was her father's name, and she was not willing to release it entirely. And Simon had said, with the completeness of a man for whom this was entirely obvious, Of course you should keep it. Their son was born in the last week of May 1880, on a warm night with a full moon and a south wind that came through the open bedroom window with the smell of new grass. Maria served as midwife with the competence of long practice, and Simon sat outside the door in the hallway with the posture of a man exerting tremendous control over the impulse to be somewhere he would be in the way. And Tomas sat with him, and they played cards badly by lantern light for 3 hours. The baby was strong and healthy, with dark hair like his father and gray eyes like his mother that Maria said would likely stay gray. They had that particular steadiness to them even at birth. They named him Eli James Shelby, Eli for the Whitmore patriarch who had looked at Belle in the courthouse corridor and thanked her, James for her father. Dutch, when he was allowed in to see the baby, went absolutely silent for 30 seconds, staring at the small person in Belle's arms with an expression of complete awe, and then said, "He's so small," in a tone of genuine wonder, and then promptly started crying again, and Maria handed him a cloth and patted him on the arm. Belle held her son in the May moonlight and felt the depth of happiness in her, full and settled and real. She looked across at Simon, who was sitting on the edge of the bed looking at both of them with the open, honest happiness she had first seen on their wedding day, and she thought about the long, improbable road that had brought her here, from Cincinnati to a train westbound to October Street in Caldwell with a gun at her head, to this room in this house on this land with this man and this child. And she thought what she had written in her journal over a year ago, still true now with more weight to it than it had carried then. I am a person who requires a large horizon. I did not know this about myself until I had one. As the summer of 1880 stretched warm and full across the Kansas prairie, the ranch grew into its shape. Tomas's boys had become constant presences in the yard, learning to work alongside their father with the natural absorption of children raised around livestock and land. Dutch had, the previous spring, bought a piece of land 4 miles east with Simon's help in negotiating the price and Belle's help in reviewing the deed. And while he still worked at the Shelby ranch 3 days a week, he was building something of his own with a focused joy that Belle found deeply satisfying to watch. She corresponded regularly with Clara Holt in Caldwell, who had news of the town's gradual improvement following the removal of Briggs and Cross's influence. A new sheriff had been elected, a sensible man from the eastern part of the county. The Whitmore family had returned to their land and were rebuilding. Mrs. Pratt had apparently purchased a small boarding house with money she had been quietly saving for years, and was running it with the flat efficiency that had always been her dominant quality, and was, by Clara's account, quite content. Belle wrote long letters home to her mother, who wrote long letters back, and the letters were the honest correspondence of two people who knew each other completely and found each other's company enriching even at 900 miles distance. Her mother was considering, Belle's mother had hinted in increasing detail, the possibility of coming west permanently. Belle had written back with an explicit invitation that had included a full account of the available accommodations and the social situation of the nearest towns, because her mother would need that information to make a proper assessment, and had added at the end, "We want you here. Eli wants to know his grandmother. Simon wants you here. Come." Her mother came in September 1880, on the same westbound train line that Belle had ridden 2 years earlier, arriving at the Caldwell station in the same manner, 2 trunks and a composed expression. But the woman who met her was not the desperate practical stranger who had been met by Harlan Cross. She was Belle Shelby, standing on the platform with a baby on her hip and her husband beside her, and a happiness about her that her mother could see from 20 feet away. And when they embraced, her mother held her for a long moment and said quietly, in the private language of mothers and daughters, "You did good, my darling. You did so very good." "We did," Belle said, and looked at Simon over her mother's shoulder, and he was looking back at her with those steady dark eyes, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that of all the things she had done in her 26 years of life, the most courageous was not getting off the ground in the middle of Main Street when a man had a gun at her head. It was the choice, made in full knowledge of the risk, and with the clear eyes she had always turned toward things she was afraid of, to stay. Her mother settled in the spring of 1881, after a winter spent in Clara's spare room in Caldwell and several long visits to the ranch, into a small house in the town of Wellington, 15 miles north, which had recently established a school. She became its first full-time teacher, which was the occupation her intelligence and training had always properly belonged to, and she rode out to the ranch twice a month and Belle rode into Wellington twice a month, and the distance was exactly right, close enough for genuine connection, and far enough for the independence they both needed. Eli learned to walk in February 1881, the determined, lurching progress of a boy who had clearly decided that mobility was a problem to be solved, and he solved it over 3 days of concerted effort and approximately 40 falls that he treated with the philosophical acceptance of a person committed to a project. Simon watched this process with the concentrated attention of a father who had not known, until he had it, how much he would love this particular thing, the watching of his child work out how to be in the world. Belle came in from the kitchen one afternoon to find Simon sitting on the floor of the main room at Eli's level, watching the boy attempt a circuit of the room, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at them, this man and this child, and felt something so complete and full in her that it had no name she could apply to it, only the wordless knowledge of abundance, of life grown beyond what you dared to plan for. Simon heard her and looked up, and they looked at each other across the room with the ease of people who no longer needed to account for everything they felt because they already knew. And then Eli reached the far wall and turned around with the enormous satisfaction of someone who has accomplished a serious objective, and held out both arms to the room at large, and they both laughed. By the spring of 1882, Belle was expecting again, a discovery she made with the same calm it took her to receive most important information, and the private, internal brightness that she kept inside her, as the thing she did not need to explain or perform for anyone. Simon said, when she told him, "I'm less terrified this time," and she said, "That's statistically appropriate given increased experience," and he laughed and held her in the kitchen in the afternoon light. Their second child was a girl, born in November 1882 on a cold afternoon, with the first snow of the season falling outside the window, small and fierce and entirely herself from the first moment, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth, and a temperament that Maria, who was again present at the birth, described as formidable with the tone of a woman paying the highest compliment she knew. They named her Catherine Rose, Catherine for the grandmother who had come west on a train and found her proper work, Rose because Belle had always loved the name and had been waiting for the occasion to use it. Eli met his sister with the serious consideration of a 2-year-old encountering something important. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, which was already his characteristic approach to significant situations, nothing at all, but he touched her hand very gently with one finger, and that was enough. The years settled into themselves. The ranch grew. Tomas's boys grew into young men who were as much a part of the landscape of the Shelby Ranch as the cattle and the horses and the cottonwood trees along the South Creek. Dutch's own spread 4 miles east had become a proper operation, and he came to dinner on Sunday evenings with the regularity of a man who has found the kind of family that is chosen rather than born, and intends to hold on to it. Belle kept her accounts with the meticulous care she had always brought to systems, and she expanded them. She began a correspondence with a woman in Wichita who was attempting to establish a lending library, and contributed both money and practical organizational advice. She wrote occasional pieces for the Caldwell commercial under the name B. Shelby, practical essays on ranch management and accounting methods that were read, she knew, by both men and women in the county, which satisfied something in her that needed to be useful in a wider radius than one household. She taught Eli to read at 4, Catherine at 3, with the instinctive methods of a woman raised by a teacher, and with the precise pleasure of watching understanding arrive in a child's eyes, the particular light of it. Simon watched the teaching with the same attention he brought to everything important in his life, and learned from it, and became the kind of father who read aloud to his children in the evenings in the way that makes literature a living thing rather than an obligation. There were hard years alongside the good ones, because the prairie was not sentimental about difficulty. A drought in 1883 that dried the South Creek and required careful management of the water and the herd. A year when the cattle prices fell so low that the accounts required a precision and creativity that Belle applied with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the work she was doing had direct consequences for the people she loved. A winter in which Tomas's older son was ill for 2 months with a fever that frightened them all and then broke, and the boy recovered, and they were all profoundly glad. Through all of it, what held was what had been built on the kitchen table in the early days: the honesty, the precision, the willingness to look at things as they were and work with what was real. They did not pretend difficulties were smaller than they were, and they did not pretend they were larger. They talked everything through at the kitchen table, which was the real governing body of the Shelby Ranch, more consequential than any decision made on horseback or in a cattle yard. In the autumn of 1884, a period of settled prosperity following the good cattle year, Belle sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon with Catherine on her lap and Eli doing his schoolwork at the far end of the table, with the focused intensity that he had carried since birth. And she wrote in her journal, which she had kept since she was 14, and which now filled 6 thick volumes stored in the chest at the foot of the bedroom wardrobe. She wrote, "It is 6 years since I left Cincinnati on a westbound train with 2 trunks and the practical courage of necessity. I intended to make the best of whatever I found at the end of the line. What I found was not what I expected. What I found was better. What I found was Simon, and this land, and these children, and this life, which is entirely mine in the way that things are yours when you have earned them through honest effort and clear eyes. I know that I am happy. I know it the same way I know the accounts balance, because I have checked the figures and they are correct." Outside, Simon was riding in from the south pasture in the late gold light, and she could see him through the kitchen window, moving easily in the saddle with the particular grace that was his own, the quietness and the economy and the steadiness that she had recognized on an October morning in Main Street and had been recognizing every day since. He came in through the kitchen door and stamped the dust from his boots and reached over Belle's shoulder to touch the top of Catherine's dark head, and Catherine made a sound of contentment without looking up from the block she was building on the table, and Eli said, without looking up from his work, "Cattle look good." "They do," Simon said. Belle closed her journal. Simon poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, the habit of years, and set one in front of her and sat down across the table, and looked at her with those steady dark eyes that she had first seen 40 feet away on an October morning in 1878, and had not, in all the time since, ever looked at without the particular feeling that was both a homecoming and an arrival, as if some part of her was always returning and some part of her was always finding something new. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. The last of the October light came through the kitchen window in long warm sheets and lay across the table between them, and the children were there, and the coffee was hot, and outside the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, wide and real, and full of everything that had been made from the improbable materials of an advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper, and 2 desperate trunks and one October morning in a Kansas street, when a man rode in and said let her go, and meant it. "Simon," she said. He looked at her. "I'm glad," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, the way he had held it in the courthouse gallery in Wichita after the verdict was read, and held it with the same careful certainty, the certainty of a man who had found the thing he was most glad of and had every intention of holding it as long as he lived. "So am I," he said, "every day." Catherine leaned over and put her small hand on top of their joined hands, because she was 3 years old and had a strong opinion about being included in everything. Eli looked up from his work with an expression of elaborate patience that was so purely his father's that Belle and Simon both saw it at the same moment, and smiled at each other over the children's heads in the private language of parents who know each other's faces completely. The prairie evening came down around the ranch in its full October colors, amber and rose and the deep violet of the coming dark, and the house was warm and lit from within, and somewhere across the 4 miles of good Kansas grass, Dutch Elliot was probably already on his way to Sunday dinner, and Tomas and Maria were sitting on their own porch in the last of the light. And the world was full of real and particular things that had been made through honest work and clear eyes, and the courage that is not the dramatic courage of crisis, but the daily courage of choosing, again and again, to be present and truthful and open to what the horizon holds. Belle Archer, who was also Belle Shelby, who was a woman who required a large horizon and had found one, looked at her husband's face across the kitchen table in the warm October light and thought with the clean precision she brought to true things, "This is it. This is the life. This is exactly what it was supposed to be." And it was.